Sometimes the people who change your life don't arrive with grand promises. They simply knock on your door when you least expect it. Looking back now, I can trace everything back to that rainy Thursday in early October, when the maple trees lining our quiet street had just begun turning shades of amber and crimson. At the time, I thought my biggest challenge was finishing another set of illustrations before my publisher's deadline. I lived alone in a modest craftsman house in a peaceful neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, where the loudest sounds most mornings were lawn sprinklers clicking across freshly cut grass and the distant laughter of children walking to school. My name is Ethan Brooks. I was 27, worked as a freelance illustrator specializing in children's books, and spent most days surrounded by watercolor paints, half-finished sketches, and cups of coffee that always grew cold before I remembered to drink them. After a difficult breakup almost 2 years earlier, I had quietly convinced myself that keeping my world small was safer. My neighbors knew me as the friendly artist who always waved, but rarely stayed long enough for conversation. That routine suited me just fine. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Then the empty house next door finally sold. A moving truck arrived early on a Saturday morning, followed by a man carrying cardboard boxes with one arm while balancing a sleepy little boy on his hip with the other. Even from my porch, I could see exhaustion written across his face, but there was something gentle about the way he whispered to the child, brushing messy blonde hair away from tiny eyes before setting him down on the front steps. The little boy immediately spotted a bright orange leaf drifting across the yard and chased after it with delighted laughter. The man laughed too, quietly, as though he hadn't expected to smile that day. His name, I would later learn, was Daniel Carter. He was 30 years old, an architect who had recently accepted a position with a local design firm after relocating to be closer to family. His 6-year-old son, Oliver, possessed endless curiosity, impossible amounts of energy, and the remarkable ability to turn strangers into friends within minutes. For nearly 3 weeks, our relationship never extended beyond polite smiles over the fence or brief waves while collecting the mail. Sometimes I'd see Daniel rushing out in a pressed button-down shirt while Oliver struggled to zip his backpack. Other evenings they'd return together carrying grocery bags, laughing over something only the two of them understood. They looked like they were trying very hard to build a new normal, though I couldn't have explained why I felt that way. Then came the storm. Rain hammered against my windows just after dinner while I was cleaning paintbrushes in the kitchen sink. A sudden knock echoed through the house. When I opened the front door, Daniel stood there completely soaked despite the umbrella hanging uselessly at his side. His expression wasn't panicked, but it carried the quiet worry of someone who had already run through every other option before coming to mine. Oliver stood beside him wearing a little yellow raincoat, clutching a stuffed dinosaur almost as big as his backpack. Daniel offered an apologetic smile and cleared his throat. "I hate to ask this of someone I barely know," he said. "But could you possibly watch Oliver for just a couple of hours? There's an emergency at work, and everyone else I usually rely on is out of town." I looked down at Oliver, who gave me a hopeful grin and held up his dinosaur. Before I could think of all the reasons to say no, I heard myself answer with one simple word: "Sure." I had no idea that opening my front door that evening was also opening the first page of a completely different life. Oliver walked into my house as if he had been there 100 times before, carefully placing his little dinosaur on my coffee table before looking around with wide blue eyes. "You really painted all of these?" he asked, pointing toward the framed illustrations covering my living room walls. I smiled and nodded. "Every single one." His face lit up with genuine amazement. "My teacher says people who draw stories have magic." I laughed softly. "Your teacher sounds pretty smart," while Daniel hurried back through the rain after. Thanking me more times than necessary, Oliver had already wandered into my small studio, where sketchbooks, colored pencils, and jars of paint covered nearly every surface. Instead of touching everything like most children his age, he folded his hands behind his back and simply stared. "Daddy says I should always ask before touching other people's things," he said with surprising seriousness. "Your daddy sounds pretty smart too." He grinned proudly. "He is." That evening passed more easily than either of us expected. We made grilled cheese sandwiches with tomato soup, although Oliver insisted on cutting his sandwich into dinosaur shapes that looked absolutely nothing like dinosaurs. We laughed every time another one collapsed into the bowl. After dinner, I handed him a stack of blank paper and invited him to invent his own creatures. He drew a turtle with wings, a rabbit wearing rain boots, and something that looked suspiciously like a purple refrigerator with legs. Every drawing came with an elaborate story that somehow connected to the next one. His imagination reminded me why I had fallen in love with illustrating children's books in the first place. Hours slipped by without either of us noticing. Outside, the rain finally softened into a gentle drizzle, and the warm glow of table lamps filled the house with a quiet sense of comfort I had not realized I had been missing. When the front door finally opened close to 9 that evening, Daniel stepped inside, looking both relieved and exhausted. His tie had disappeared somewhere during the night, and damp strands of dark brown hair had fallen across his forehead. The first thing Oliver did was run over and hug him around the waist. Daniel knelt immediately, wrapping both arms around his son before asking, "Everything okay?" Oliver answered before I could. "We made dinosaur sandwiches, I invented flying turtles, and Ethan lets crayons stay messy because artists like color." Daniel looked at me with an embarrassed smile. "I owe you one." "You really do not," I replied. He was great company. For a brief second, something in Daniel's expression softened in a way I could not quite explain. It was not simply gratitude. It looked more like relief, as though someone had quietly lifted a weight he had been carrying alone for far too long. Before leaving, Oliver tugged on his father's sleeve. "Can we bring Ethan cookies tomorrow?" Daniel blinked. "Tomorrow? To say thank you." Daniel chuckled. "I think we can manage cookies." The next afternoon, a small plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies appeared on my porch with a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for helping my favorite person, Daniel." Over the following weeks, those little exchanges slowly became part of everyday life. Sometimes it was fresh blueberry muffins. Sometimes I dropped off leftover vegetable soup after making too much. Sometimes Oliver would wave excitedly through the kitchen window while I worked, proudly holding up a drawing he wanted me to see. None of it felt planned. None of it felt dramatic. Yet somewhere between warm cookies, sidewalk conversations, and a 6-year-old's endless stories about winged turtles, the quiet street that had once felt peaceful because it was empty was beginning to feel peaceful because it was finally full of life. By the time November arrived, our quiet routine had settled into something that no one had planned, yet everyone seemed to enjoy. Nearly every morning, I would find Daniel outside struggling to convince Oliver that jackets were not optional just because the sun happened to be shining. Oliver argued that it was impossible to feel cold while running. Daniel patiently explained that Oregon weather had its own opinions. Somehow, they always ended up laughing before climbing into the car. On the mornings when my deadlines were light, I would walk over carrying 2 cups of coffee. Daniel preferred his black. Mine required far too much cream. Those 5 minutes before work became an unexpected tradition. We talked about everything except the things that actually mattered. He told me stories about impossible clients who kept changing blueprints after construction had already begun. I shared ridiculous requests from publishers who believed dragons should smile more because smiling dragons sold better. Even our complaints somehow turned into jokes. One Saturday afternoon, Oliver knocked on my door carrying an empty bird feeder. "Daddy says birds are probably hungry too," he announced. The 3 of us drove to a local garden center a few miles away, where Oliver carefully examined every bag of birdseed as though making an important scientific decision. He convinced Daniel that squirrels deserved snacks too, despite Daniel insisting that squirrels were perfectly capable of stealing food without encouragement. Watching them tease each other felt strangely comforting. There was an ease between father and son that came from years of learning how to keep smiling through difficult days. Later that afternoon, while Oliver proudly filled the feeder in the backyard, Daniel quietly leaned against the porch railing beside me. "Thank you," he said, "for more than that first night." I shrugged. "I like spending time with both of you." He looked toward Oliver before speaking again. He has laughed more these past few weeks than he has in a long time. There was a softness in his voice that carried both gratitude and sadness. I wanted to ask what had happened before they moved here, but something told me that question belonged to Daniel alone until he decided otherwise. Instead, I simply nodded and watched Oliver cheer every time a sparrow landed nearby. As autumn slowly gave way to colder mornings, our little neighborhood began preparing for Thanksgiving. Houses decorated their porches with pumpkins and wreaths, while children practiced songs for the elementary school holiday program. One evening, Oliver proudly invited me to attend because he had been chosen to narrate the opening lines. I arrived expecting a simple school performance and found myself sitting beside Daniel in a crowded cafeteria, filled with folding chairs and proud families holding phones in the air. When Oliver stepped onto the stage wearing an oversized brown paper turkey hat, he immediately spotted us. His nervous expression disappeared, replaced by a confident grin that somehow made the entire room brighter. After the performance, his teacher walked over and smiled warmly. "Your family has such wonderful energy," she said without hesitation. Daniel and I exchanged an awkward glance, neither of us correcting her before Oliver reached for both of our hands at the same time. He seemed completely unaware that anything about the moment might be unusual. For him, it felt natural. As we walked home beneath strings of neighborhood lights, Oliver skipped several steps ahead, humming one of the songs from school. Daniel broke the comfortable silence with a quiet laugh. "He really likes having you around." I watched Oliver chasing leaves across the sidewalk before answering honestly. "I really like being around him too." Neither of us said anything after that, but for the first time since we had met, the silence between us no longer felt like two neighbors standing side by side. It felt like two people slowly discovering that the happiest parts of life often begin as the smallest routines. December arrived with crisp mornings, sparkling frost on rooftops, and the familiar scent of pine drifting through the neighborhood as families decorated for the holidays. By then, our routines had become so natural that none of us questioned them anymore. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Oliver came to my house after school, while Daniel finished meetings that always seemed to run longer than expected. We would spread art supplies across my dining table, turning ordinary afternoons into imaginary adventures. Some days we painted snowmen wearing astronaut helmets. Other days we invented entire towns where every mailbox belonged to a different animal. Oliver insisted that squirrels made the best mail carriers because they never forgot where they buried anything. I told him that was surprisingly convincing logic. Before long, Daniel would appear at my front door carrying the tired smile that had somehow become less tired over the past few months. Instead of rushing home immediately, he often stayed for dinner. Nothing fancy ever appeared on the table. We made homemade chili, baked macaroni and cheese, roasted vegetables, or breakfast for dinner whenever none of us felt like following a recipe. The conversations were simple, but they filled the house with a warmth that lingered long after the dishes had been washed. One Saturday, the town held its annual holiday market in the community park. Strings of white lights stretched between wooden booths selling handmade ornaments, fresh cider, knitted scarves, and warm cinnamon pastries. Oliver ran from one display to another with endless excitement, while Daniel and I struggled to keep up without spilling our hot chocolate. At one booth, children could decorate gingerbread houses. Oliver immediately signed all three of us up before either Daniel or I had a chance to object. Our creation leaned noticeably to one side because Oliver insisted every roof needed extra candy, but he proudly declared it the greatest gingerbread house in Oregon. A volunteer walked by, laughed kindly, and offered to take a family picture for us. Daniel hesitated for only a heartbeat before handing over his phone. Oliver squeezed between us, wrapped one arm around each of our waists, and smiled so brightly that every hesitation disappeared. Looking at the picture afterward, I realized something unexpected. None of us looked uncomfortable. We simply looked happy. Later that evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep during the short drive home, Daniel and I carried bags of holiday decorations from his garage. As we untangled strands of lights across his front porch, he suddenly laughed at himself. "I used to dread decorating," he admitted quietly. "It always felt like one more thing to survive after everything changed. This year feels different." I clipped another strand into place before answering. "Maybe traditions are easier when you do not have to carry them alone." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful but peaceful. "I think you might be right." Before either of us could say anything else, the porch lights flickered on all at once, casting a warm golden glow across the yard. At that exact moment, Oliver woke up inside the house, pressed both hands against the living room window, and shouted excitedly, "It looks like home." His words were innocent, spoken without any deeper meaning, yet they settled quietly into my heart. Standing beneath those lights beside Daniel, with laughter echoing through the cold evening air, I realized that somewhere between shared meals, ordinary conversations, school events, and holiday traditions, the empty spaces in all three of our lives had begun filling with something neither planned nor expected. None of us had given that feeling a name, but it was becoming harder with each passing day to imagine what life had looked like before the three houses on our little corner of the street somehow became one shared story. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed with the comforting rhythm of familiar routines, and without anyone ever discussing it, we had quietly become part of one another's daily lives. Daniel still left for work every weekday morning with a travel mug in one hand and Oliver's backpack in the other. But now there was almost always an extra cup of coffee waiting for him on my porch before he reached his driveway. Sometimes we exchanged only a few words before the day began. Other mornings we stood outside for 10 minutes talking about books, architecture, or the strange weather that could change from sunshine to rain in less than an hour. Those conversations became my favorite part of every morning. One afternoon, just before Christmas break, Oliver arrived carrying a folded piece of construction paper with an unusually serious expression. "It is a secret," he whispered before handing it to me. Inside was a hand-drawn picture of three stick figures standing beneath yellow Christmas lights. One figure wore glasses that looked suspiciously like mine. Another had dark hair like Daniel. The smallest one held both of our hands. Across the top, written in careful 6-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My favorite people." My heart tightened in the gentlest possible way. I thanked him, folded the drawing carefully, and slipped it into my sketchbook, knowing I would keep it forever. That evening, after Oliver had gone upstairs to get ready for bed, Daniel noticed the picture resting on my kitchen counter. He smiled quietly before rubbing the back of his neck. "He has been talking about you almost every day," he admitted. "Apparently, I am no longer the funniest person in the house." I laughed. "That sounds like a very competitive title." "I lost it weeks ago," Daniel replied with a grin. The laughter faded into a comfortable silence as we finished loading the dishwasher together. Finally, he spoke again, this time more thoughtfully. "I used to think I had everything planned. Career, family, the future. Then life reminded me that plans can disappear overnight." He paused for a moment before continuing. "After that happened, I stopped thinking about happiness. I focused on responsibility instead. Taking care of Oliver became the only thing that mattered." I rested my hands against the kitchen counter, giving him the space to continue without interrupting. "Somewhere along the way," he said softly, "I forgot that surviving is not the same as living." His words stayed with me long after he walked next door. I understood them more deeply than I wanted to admit because I had done something remarkably similar after my own heartbreak. I had filled my days with work, deadlines, and routines until loneliness no longer felt sharp. It had simply become familiar. Yet over the past few months, laughter had slowly replaced silence. Shared dinners had replaced solitary meals. A house that once echoed with nothing but the scratch of pencils across paper now carried the sound of conversations drifting in from the kitchen. A few days later, Daniel invited Oliver and me to help choose a Christmas tree from a local tree farm about 20 miles outside town. Oliver spent nearly half an hour insisting that every tree deserved a family before finally selecting one that leaned slightly to the left because, in his words, "Nobody is perfect, and that makes it special." As we tied the tree to the roof of Daniel's sport utility vehicle, his phone rang. The cheerful expression on his face slowly disappeared while he listened. After thanking the caller, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and stared across the snowy field for several quiet seconds. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. Daniel forced a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "My firm wants me to meet with the regional director after New Year's," he answered. "Apparently, they have something important to discuss." He tried to sound casual, but I could hear uncertainty beneath every word. Neither of us realized then that a single meeting waiting on the other side of the holidays would soon test everything our quiet little family had begun to build together. The holiday season passed in a blur of warm dinners, neighborhood lights, and quiet moments that somehow mattered more than the celebrations themselves. On New Year's Day, the three of us bundled into thick coats and walked to the small park a few blocks away, where families gathered to watch children race homemade wooden sleds down a gentle hill. Oliver laughed so hard every time his sled spun sideways that strangers nearby started laughing with him. Daniel stood beside me holding 2 paper cups of hot chocolate, smiling in a way that looked lighter than I had ever seen. For a brief moment, I caught myself wondering what life might look like if days like this simply continued forever. Then Monday arrived. Daniel left early for the meeting at his office, looking unusually nervous despite trying to hide it behind an encouraging smile for Oliver. I spent the morning finishing illustrations, but found myself glancing at the clock more often than my computer screen. Around 4 that afternoon, I noticed Daniel's sport utility vehicle pull into the driveway much later than usual. Instead of coming inside for coffee as he often did, he remained sitting behind the steering wheel for several minutes before finally walking toward his front door. Something felt different. That evening, after Oliver had gone upstairs to finish his homework, Daniel knocked softly on my back door. We stood in the kitchen while a kettle warmed on the stove, neither of us speaking until steam began drifting into the room. Finally, he exhaled. The meeting was about a promotion. I smiled immediately. "Daniel, that is wonderful." He nodded slowly, but the smile I expected never appeared. "It is a regional leadership position." He paused before quietly adding, "In Seattle." The words settled between us with surprising weight. Seattle was only a few hours away by plane, yet it suddenly felt like another world. Daniel explained that the opportunity came with a significant salary increase, a larger design team, and projects he had dreamed about leading since graduating from college. Anyone listening would have called it the opportunity of a lifetime. "They are giving me 3 weeks to decide," he said. I stirred my tea, even though it no longer needed stirring. "You have worked hard for this." "I know, and you deserve it." He looked at me carefully before asking the question I had been quietly avoiding myself. "Then why does it feel like saying yes would mean leaving behind the first place that has ever started feeling like home again?" Neither of us answered. We simply stood there listening to the gentle whistle of the kettle cooling on the stove. Over the next several days, life continued almost exactly the same on the surface. Oliver still came over after school. We still drew ridiculous animals and baked cookies that somehow ended up with more frosting on the counter than on the cookies themselves. Daniel still joined us for dinner whenever work allowed. Yet beneath every ordinary conversation lingered the unspoken reality that all of it might soon end. One afternoon, while Oliver colored superheroes at the dining table, he looked up unexpectedly and asked, "Do you think Seattle has good squirrels?" I laughed. "Probably." He frowned thoughtfully. "Daddy keeps looking at maps on his computer." My smile faded before I could hide it. "Has he talked to you about it?" Oliver shook his head. "Not really. He just asks if I would like a new school." He lowered his crayon and spoke so quietly that I almost missed it. I already like my school. That evening, after Oliver had gone home, I found myself staring at the drawing he had made weeks earlier of the 3 of us standing beneath Christmas lights. For the first time since he had handed it to me, I wondered whether it had captured a future that would never happen or a memory that had already quietly slipped away before any of us realized how deeply we had begun depending on one another. The following week felt strangely quieter, even though nothing around us had actually changed. The same school bus stopped every morning at the corner. The same coffee brewed before sunrise. The same birds gathered around the feeder Oliver had proudly filled back in the fall. Yet every ordinary moment now carried an invisible countdown. Daniel never brought up Seattle unless I asked, and eventually I stopped asking. I told myself I was giving him space to make an important decision, but the truth was much simpler. I was afraid of hearing the answer. Instead, I threw myself into work, accepting extra illustration projects that kept me busy late into the evening. Daniel noticed, of course. He always noticed. One Thursday, he invited Oliver and me over for homemade pizza. Normally, we would have spent hours laughing over burnt crusts and ridiculous toppings that Oliver invented. But that night, every conversation seemed to end a little sooner than usual. Even Oliver sensed the difference. He kept looking back and forth between us with the puzzled expression only children wear when they know something feels wrong, but cannot understand why. After dinner, while Daniel washed dishes, Oliver quietly tugged on my sweater sleeve. "Come see my room," he whispered. The moment we stepped upstairs, he closed the bedroom door and climbed onto his bed beside a row of stuffed animals. "Did I do something bad?" he asked so softly that it almost broke my heart. I sat beside him and shook my head. "Why would you think that?" He stared down at his hands. Daddy has been sad again. And you have been quiet too. When grown-ups get quiet, something changes. His words caught me completely off guard because they were painfully true. I smiled gently and brushed a strand of blonde hair away from his forehead. None of this is because of you, Oliver. Sometimes adults have big decisions to make, and they forget to talk about what they are feeling. He thought about that for a moment before asking another question. If we move away, will you still draw with me? I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. Before I could force a reply, he wrapped his small arms around me. I do not want another goodbye, he whispered. My chest tightened. Children often understand loss far better than adults realize. They simply describe it with fewer words. Later that evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Daniel found me standing on the back porch watching snowflakes drift beneath the porch light. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he broke the silence. He asked me yesterday if homes can miss people. I looked over at him. What did you tell him? Daniel gave a tired smile. I told him houses cannot. He paused before quietly adding, I think I was wrong. A light breeze carried the scent of pine through the yard as we stood shoulder to shoulder, watching fresh snow settle across the fence between our homes. Daniel slipped both hands into his coat pockets. The strange thing is that this promotion is everything I wanted a year ago, he admitted. Now I cannot tell whether saying yes means moving toward my future or walking away from it. I looked across the yard toward the warm glow coming from my own kitchen window, then back at the lights shining inside his house. Somewhere along the way, those two separate homes had begun to feel connected by something much stronger than a property line. Neither of us had been brave enough to name that feeling yet, but for the first time, it was impossible to pretend it was not there, quietly asking both of us the same question we had spent weeks trying to avoid. 3 days before Daniel's deadline, the neighborhood woke beneath a sky so clear that even the snow-covered rooftops seemed brighter than usual. I had just finished sending the final illustrations for my latest book to the publisher when someone knocked rapidly on my front door. Expecting a package delivery, I opened it to find Oliver standing there in his winter boots, breathing hard after running across the yard. Daddy is talking to Seattle again, he said between breaths. Can you come? I followed him next door without asking another question. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, several architectural drawings spread across the surface, and his phone resting silently beside a mug of untouched coffee. He looked up as I walked in and managed a tired smile. Sorry, Oliver thought I needed rescuing. Oliver climbed onto a chair and folded his arms. You do. Daniel laughed for the first time in days. Apparently, I have been outvoted. We spent the afternoon doing something completely unrelated to career decisions. Oliver insisted that the old bird feeder needed repainting before spring arrived, so the three of us carried newspapers, paintbrushes, and cans of bright colors into the garage. Before long, there was blue paint on Oliver's nose, green paint on my sleeve, and a tiny yellow handprint on the edge of Daniel's sweatshirt that made all three of us laugh until our stomachs hurt. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that never appeared in photographs because no one thought it was important enough. Yet somewhere in the middle of that laughter, I realized those were exactly the moments I would miss the most if Daniel left. As the paint dried, Oliver disappeared upstairs to build a blanket fort in his bedroom, leaving Daniel and me alone in the quiet garage. He looked at the colorful bird feeder for a long moment before speaking. Do you know what my manager asked me yesterday? I shook my head. He asked what was keeping me from accepting the promotion immediately. He listed salary, prestige, leadership, bigger projects. He thought I was weighing numbers. Daniel smiled gently, almost to himself. The truth is, I have not been thinking about numbers at all. He turned toward me with an honesty I had never seen before. I have been thinking about Saturday mornings drinking coffee on neighboring porches. I have been thinking about hearing Oliver laugh through your kitchen window. I have been thinking about dinners that somehow became traditions without anyone planning them. My heartbeat quickened, but neither of us looked away. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key attached to a simple wooden keychain. Without saying anything, he placed it in the palm of my hand. I stared at it in confusion. That is my spare house key, he said quietly. I realized something this week. Every time I imagined leaving, I was never worried about the new job. I was worried about losing this. He glanced toward the house, where Oliver's muffled laughter drifted down the hallway. Then he looked back at me. You once told me that traditions are easier when you do not have to carry them alone. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being my neighbor, Ethan. You became the person who makes this place feel like home. My throat tightened as I wrapped my fingers around the key. Daniel took a slow breath before adding the words that neither of us had been brave enough to say for months. I think you are already part of our home, if you want to be. Before I could answer, Oliver burst into the garage wearing a blanket like a superhero cape and proudly announced that his fort was finally finished. Daniel and I exchanged a smile that carried more understanding than any dramatic declaration ever could, then followed him inside together. Both of us knowing that the most important decision had already been made long before Seattle ever called. 1 year later, spring returned to our little neighborhood with fresh green leaves, blooming dogwood trees, and the familiar chorus of birds that still gathered around the colorful feeder we had painted together in the garage. Some things had changed. Many things had not. Daniel had turned down the promotion in Seattle a few days after our conversation. Instead, he accepted a leadership role with the same architectural firm in Portland, one that offered slower career growth, but something he had come to value far more deeply: time. Time to eat breakfast with Oliver before school. Time to coach Saturday morning soccer games. Time to share dinners that no longer felt like special occasions because they had simply become part of everyday life. Around the same time, my publisher released my newest children's book. The story followed a curious little squirrel who believed every lonely bird deserved a colorful home. Oliver proudly announced to everyone who would listen that the squirrel was inspired by his own ideas. And to be completely honest, he was right. At the book signing held in a cozy independent bookstore downtown, Daniel and Oliver stood quietly near the back of the room while families waited for signed copies. When a little girl asked me where I found the inspiration for my stories, I looked toward the two people smiling at me across the room and answered honestly. The best stories usually begin with ordinary people who remind us what really matters. Daniel smiled without saying a word because he understood exactly what I meant. Summer arrived, bringing longer evenings and neighborhood barbecues where everyone naturally assumed we belonged together. Nobody questioned why I always had a key to Daniel's house or why Oliver ran freely between our backyards without knocking. The wooden fence that once separated our properties slowly became more symbolic than practical. One weekend, while replacing a few weathered fence boards, Daniel looked at the narrow gate connecting our yards and laughed. "You know," he said, "we spend more time walking through this gate than using our front doors." I picked up a measuring tape and looked at the fence thoughtfully. Maybe we should stop pretending it is a barrier. The next Saturday, with help from a few friendly neighbors, we removed an entire section of the fence and replaced it with a wide wooden arbor covered in climbing roses. Oliver insisted on hanging a small hand-painted sign above the opening. In uneven blue letters, it simply read, "Welcome home." Every evening after that, the open path between our houses filled with ordinary moments that slowly became unforgettable memories. Sometimes it was the smell of hamburgers cooking on the grill. Sometimes it was Daniel reviewing blueprints at the patio table while I sketched nearby and Oliver chased fireflies across the lawn. Sometimes it was nothing more than three people sitting quietly beneath strings of warm lights, listening to crickets after a long day. Looking back now, I finally understand something I could not have seen on that rainy night when a tired father first knocked on my door asking for help. Love rarely arrives all at once. More often, it grows quietly inside ordinary routines, shared responsibilities, patient conversations, and countless small acts of kindness repeated often enough that one day you realize they have become the foundation of an entirely new life. We did not build our future through dramatic promises or perfect plans. We built it one shared meal, one painted bird feeder, one school concert, one cup of coffee, one laugh, and one open door at a time. And every evening, as the porch lights came on and Oliver raced happily through the arbor connecting our two homes, I was reminded that sometimes the greatest gift life offers is not finding the perfect place to live, but finding the people who finally make that place feel like home.